One matter that's getting dragged to the forefront of modern discourse, essentially, is energy, cleanliness, and efficiency. Now, of course, there obviously does appear to be some level of tension between clear energy and efficient energy on the surface level. That is according to what the people pushing the energy regulation and legislation present as supposedly clean energy. So what I mean by this is that if we take the people calling for, let's say, the Green New Deal as an example, what they're calling for is a very widespread and a very extensive governmental control that is going to impact virtually everybody in the nation on a personal level. But if we put that aside for the moment, the Green New Deal excludes nuclear power, explicitly, because they claim that it presents a danger to the environment. And I mean, I can cite, for example, official statements concerning the Green New Deal, where the U.S. government explicitly does claim that it does hope to transition off of nuclear power as soon as possible. And in fact, the deal's proponents are actually hoping to do it within the next 10 years. Now, what I find that many of these legislators are overlooking is that nuclear energy is actually better for the environment, and it's also less financially burdensome precisely because of how much more energy it can produce compared to a lot of these other options, such as solar or wind, that they're championing. So, for example, as far as whether or not nuclear energy is actually fit to combat the threat of climate change, these statistics do show that nuclear energy has actually lowered, a lot of carbon dioxide emissions by, I believe the statistic was about 60 gigatons or so over the past half century. And for that matter, if we can look to the World Nuclear Association. I do know that they've cited as well that today's use of nuclear power has actually reduced emissions that are equivalent to just removing about 1/3 of the entire world's cars, the entire globe, that is.
Yeah.
So I mean, I could go on and on with examples to put this into perspective, but I'm just curious about what is your plan in regards to energy? And at the heart of that, what is your personal stance on being energy efficient?
Yeah, I think we want to see clean air, clean water, right? We want to see efficient energy use. And you're right. I think nuclear actually is, for way too long, has actually had its hands tied. It's been overregulated and had too much red tape. And if you look at the modern nuclear technology, if we're not going to put that in the portfolio of the future, you're not being serious about wanting to reduce carbon. Like, that's just being realistic. We need nuclear energy if you're somebody who wants to reduce carbon in the air. And I think we need nuclear energy if you're somebody who wants to have cleaner air and water in the future. There's several advantages to it. First off, you can use small modular reactors today to power small towns and cities with a much smaller land use footprint than, say, wind farms or solar farms, and you don't have to mine a ton of lithium to produce it. You can use nuclear power using thorium salt reactors to actually use processed nuclear waste and reprocess that and use that for power. And so there's a way to actually even reuse the old nuclear waste that we have, which, by the way, all the nuclear waste we've ever produced fits into a much smaller land use than, again, the amount of land you would have to mine to get all the solar cells, or the amount of land placement you have to use for the solar cells. And so I think in a true free market race for energy, nuclear has a huge advantage and would in the long run if we undid the regulation and red tape around it. That just is unneeded, because politicians are thinking like Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. They're thinking about things from 50 years ago. That'd be like if they were trying to regulate car safety of today using cars from 50 years ago. Look how much safer cars are today. It's because we've innovated, we've moved forward. The same as with nuclear technology. And so my policy, if I were president, is first off, to remove all subsidies for all energy. The energy we subsidize the most is coal, oil, and natural gas. And so reduce all those subsidies at all, remove them all, and let them openly compete on the free market. And I think consumers will ask for cleaner choices. They'll ask for nuclear, they'll ask for wind and solar to be part of that portfolio as well, and possibly natural gas as a transitionary fuel to get us ultimately over the hump where we can fully nuclear power this nation. But again, government shouldn't be picking those winners and losers. Individual consumers should be making those decisions. And I think they're going to want a cleaner, better future via nuclear power. I think it's a huge mistake when these people on the left, the Green Party, for example, tries to think that they're going to power the future without using nuclear power. It's just the math does not math there. And so it's not being realistic. And it, frankly, to me, is just a sign of how unserious some of these folks really are about having cleaner air and cleaner water. And I'll speak on one more thing. I spoke to a lot of farmers in Iowa and South Dakota who are upset about these carbon sequestration pipelines that they're trying to build through land via eminent domain. It's because they think, hey, we'll take the carbon from these coal plants we'll put them through a pipeline, we'll shoot it down really far into the earth, and it'll sequester it. Well, that works great until a pipeline breaks and you spew a bunch of CO2 in the air that'll cause people to get very sick. It'll cause cars to stop running. It can cause people to have brain damage, which is what we saw in Satorsha, Mississippi. And to eminent domain this, to be building a pipeline within 400 feet of people's homes, is completely ridiculous. And for the just one more fact, you use a quarter of that coal-fired power plant's energy just to power the pipeline. So you've just made that coal-fired power plant, which is already putting carbon in the air or being inefficient, even more inefficient by building the damn pipeline. And so let's be realistic about these things, and let's unleash the power of nuclear instead of trying to pass tons of subsidies to give to energy companies to eminent domain land in Iowa and South Dakota to build carbon sequestration pipelines.
Even beyond the level of, how functionally unsound this idea is, if we look at just the economic impact, the financial lack of viability to this idea of allowing the government to essentially control which forms of energy, businesses and private citizens are allowed to use. I know that the team behind the Green New Deal has claimed that they can pay for this idea through multiple routes. Predominantly, their plan has been listed as using the Federal Reserve to extend credit. We can safely conclude that these people are in very much opposition to Ron Paul. But they also plan to essentially create new government-run public banks that can also extend credit. And, since this in itself may also not be enough to actually cover it, they've also refused to rule out a carbon tax. I do know that the Carbon Tax Center has simultaneously endorsed the Green New Deal, and they've also explicitly said that a very large carbon tax wouldn't be enough to actually reach the emission reductions that, the International Panel on Climate Change, if I believe their name is, says are going to be required to do this. And, what I think is certainly ironic here is that, banning this nuclear power will, in fact, increase emissions. I do know that there was something of an experiment in Vermont, ironically enough, the home of the notorious Green New Deal supporter Bernie Sanders. I do know back in 2005, the state of Vermont's legislators, in fact, they claimed that just by exclusively using renewable energy and by rejecting nuclear power, I do know that they said that the state would have emissions levels that were 25% lower than they were in 1990 by the year 2012. And then from there, they would be 50% lower by 2028. And of course, that's not what the trends have ended up demonstrating. Since then, Vermont's emissions have actually risen at twice the level of the rest of the nation's average during that same time period. And yes, I do know there are also plenty of other statistics that show how badly this attempt to cut down on emissions has backfired. But my point here is that the U.S. is currently just in no position at all to get rid of nuclear energy.
Oh, well, and one more thing about energy efficiency, and if you want to get rid of carbon, if you want to get rid of a lot of the carbon use in the United States, we should cut down on the greatest user and emitter of carbon in this country, and that's the United States military and our foreign interventionism around the world. We spew tons of carbon in the air when we fly jets and tanks and all sorts of weapon systems. And if we removed that mission from being a militaristic empire around the world and instead focused on just protecting the homeland, we could cut down a lot of that carbon use. So I encourage these Green New Dealers to actually become back to being an anti-war folks. We used to have an anti-war left in this country. I guess they disappeared because a guy named Barack Obama got elected. And so maybe we need to return to that, and we can entice them by saying, see, we're cutting down on carbon when we stop killing innocent people overseas via our drone warfare and our militaristic empire. Maybe that's what we'll take to get the left finally about being anti-war again. It's not the dead people, it's the carbon use. That's what we need to do. Let's focus them on that, and maybe they'll come to the idea that being anti-war is a good thing again.